This tutorial will focus on the difference between artificial selection and selective breeding, but also how the two are very closely related. Artificial selection, the very term, is meant to contrast with that other kind of selection that's part of the evolutionary process, which of course is natural selection. And it's worth remembering at this point that natural selection involves the environment of the organism doing the selecting. So the environment puts pressure on the organism for its survival. So in that sense, it's the environment or the elements in the environment that select those organisms that are best able to survive in that environment. And by the environment, we mean all the aspects that make up an environment, whether it's the presence of predators, or the availability of shelter, or food, or water, or space, or climate, or weather, or parasites, or disease. Whatever it is that makes up the total environment of an organism selects those individuals that are best able to survive. That is natural selection. That is nature selecting organisms best able to survive. So that's that's a central important concept of evolution. Artificial selection, of course, is a contrast to that. So I'm just going to wipe that off the page for a minute and return to artificial selection. So artificial selection involves people, humans, doing the selecting. So we select those individuals, either animals or plants, that we want particular characteristics of. So in this particular picture here, we have a case or an example where humans have selected different parts of a wild mustard plant. This would have gone back in time. So we've selected different parts of the wild mustard plant and artificially selected those bits to then breed up and select over time to give us particular vegetables that are of interest to us. And it's really interesting to have a look at this. We can see that selecting for the stem has given us this particular vegetable, kohlrabi. Selection for the lateral buds of the wild mustard has given us Brussels sprouts. Selection for the terminal buds, that's the buds at the end of the wild mustard, has given us cabbages. Selection for the flower clusters in the wild mustard has given us cauliflowers. Selection for the stems and the flowers of the wild mustard has given us broccoli. Selection for the leaves has given us kale. So we have artificially selected, that is, human beings have selected these different parts of the wild mustard to then selectively breed, and then over a number of generations we have created the very vegetable that we are after by modifying the wild mustard plant by selecting those bits of it that are of interest to us. So artificial selection can involve selecting plants or crops with particular features that we're interested in. It could involve, of course, selecting certain animals of interest to us. So it might involve selecting certain cattle because they have a particularly high yield of beef or muscle for meat. So we select the animal that we want to breed. That is artificial selection. We are selecting it to go through the mating process. We may select particular breeds of dog that are of interest to us, like poodles, and then we can breed them up to give the desired characteristics. We can artificially select particular pigs and then put them through selective breeding to give us a particular animal that we're interested in. And over time, we could actually change the form of an animal significantly. And this is an interesting picture. We can see the bulldog as it was in the 1790s, which is only a few hundred years ago, and what the bulldog looks like now. And that has come about by artificially selecting those dogs with the desired characteristics and then breeding them up, so that in just a few centuries we have changed the shape and look of the bulldog as we know it. If that was left to natural selection, that may or may not happen depending on the pressures in the environment, and it would take much longer than artificial selection, where we are directing the selection very specifically towards the end that we want. Let's finish this tutorial by just looking at the notion of selective breeding. And here's a pedigree chart of 4 different bloodlines involved in dogs. And if you have a look at it carefully, it might look very complicated, but that's not the important part of this diagram. The point is that human beings have artificially selected various dogs within different bloodlines that have particular characteristics of interest. So, for example, in bloodline A, humans or people have chosen this particular dog to mate. In bloodline B, and C and D and so on. So we have picked out particular dogs, that is, we have artificially selected them because we are doing the selecting for them, and then we have selectively bred them to pass on the desired characteristics to their offspring. And then once we have the offspring, we can mate those offspring with dogs of other characteristics, and so on. So down the line we end up with dogs which have the characteristics that we are after. And we do this by artificially selecting, that is, selecting the dog that we want in each generation, that has the characteristics we desire, and then choosing to breed that animal with another animal to get the desired characteristics over just a handful of generations. So I hope I've made this clear, that artificial selection is us doing the selecting of an animal. Selective breeding is then taking that animal and breeding it with another to ultimately give offspring with the desired characteristics we want.